Throughout this chapter, we've been talking about how we can go about creating hyperlinks. In the last chapter, we were looking at how we could work with images. Well, you may run into situations where you want to use an image as a hyperlink, but you want that image to be somewhat interactive. What I'm talking about right now is how we can go about creating a rollover effect with an image using CSS. Now, traditionally, this would have been done using something like JavaScript. But the CSS alternative is a better alternative because you're going to get better performance out of your web page than you would if you were going to use the older JavaScript technique. Now, with CSS, you can get away with creating buttons really with nothing more than CSS. But there may be situations where you need to use an image. And if that's the case, what I'd like to do is show you a technique using CSS to create this rollover effect. In order for us to do this, what I'd like you to do is create a new HTML document. After you create this HTML document, I want you to save it. So come up to the File menu and choose Save As. Now you want to save this inside the local site folder. I'm going to go ahead and call this rollover.html, and I'm also going to title the document Rollover. Now, like I said earlier, you would traditionally use a JavaScript solution. And let me show you what that command looks like. You would come up to the Insert menu, and from the Insert menu, you would choose Image, and then you would select Rollover Image. And this will open up a dialog box, and it's fairly simple. You need to browse for an original image, then a rollover image. When the end user mouses over the original image, the image will then be swapped with this rollover image. Now, the downside to this technique is you're making two requests to the web server, and the web server has to deliver two different images. This is a bigger tax on the server. So to avoid this, what we're going to do is use a CSS technique. The CSS technique allows us to load one image and then change the position of that image to create the illusion that we are in fact working with two different images. Let me show you what I mean. If you remember from the previous chapter, we talked about working with background images. Well, that's going to come into play using this technique. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to create a hyperlink. So what I'd like you to do is type in about into the document. After doing that, select that text, and with that text selected, come down to the Properties panel, and in the link text field, just go ahead and type in a £, and then enter or return on your keyboard. Remember, what that will do is create the anchor element around this text. Now, like I said, we don't want to work with text here. We want to display an image. So how can we do that? Well, like I said, we can do that with CSS. So what I'm going to do is collapse down the Files panel, and I'm going to go ahead and expand this a little bit so we get the two-column view of the CSS designer. The first thing that we need to do is determine the source for our CSS. Because we're focusing on just this one technique, we can write the CSS within this document. So I'm going to come over and click the plus sign, and from here, I'm going to choose Define in Page. That will create the style element. Then what we need to do is worry about creating some selectors. Now, the first selector that I want to create is a rollover class, and I want this rollover class to be specific to the anchor element. So in the selectors section, you can click the plus sign to create a new selector. I'm going to type in A, and then I'm going to create the class name, which is going to be rollover. Once you do that, you can press Enter or Return on your keyboard. We need to set up some different properties here. We certainly need a background, which will be the image that we're going to be using. But we also want to establish a width and a height, and we also want to set its display property to block. So the first thing I want to do is come over and set the width to a pixel value, and the width in this case will be 159 pixels. Now, of course, this will be unique to the image that you're working with. In our case, we're going to be working with an image that's 159 pixels wide. Then we want to set the height. The height too will be measured in pixels, and the value for the height will be 46. Once you establish that, here in the CSS designer, still in this layout section, if you scroll down, you can set the display property to block. So far, so good. The next thing that we need to do is we need to come over to the background category, and we can quickly get there by clicking this background button. Now, what we want to do is establish a URL for the background image. Go ahead and click on the URL text field to activate a blinking cursor, then you'll see a Browse button appear to the right of it. Go ahead and click it. And what I'd like you to do is navigate into the resource files that you downloaded from our site. And inside the resource files, you'll find the Chapter 6 folder, and there's the Images folder, and you'll find a graphic called rollover.png. We're going to go ahead and select that and click Open. Once we do that, we also want to set the text decoration. We want to set that property to none. So we can come over to the text category, and once you're inside the text category, you'll find the text decoration option. In this case, we're going to select none. If you wanted to come over to the split view, you can do that, and you can see this rule that has been written for us. But let's come back to the design view, and inside the design view, I want you to select the About text. And what we want to do is apply this rollover class. So we can do that by coming over to the class drop-down menu in the Properties Inspector, and we can choose Rollover. Once we do that, you should see the text appear, which is perfect. Now the problem is, we have this text on top of the image. We don't want to see the About text. Actually, we probably should have typed in Home, but it doesn't really matter because we're not going to see this text. In order for us to hide this text, we're going to create another rule. So in the CSS Designer, select the Style element. In the Selectors section, go ahead and click the plus sign. And here, we're going to create a class called Move. So I'm going to go ahead and type that in and press Enter or Return. Once you do that, we want to set the position property to absolute. So again, here in the Property section, under the Layout category, you'll find Position. Right now, it's set to the default, but we can come over and choose Absolute. Once you choose Absolute, we want to set its left property. We want to set the left property to an extreme value of negative 5,000 pixels. By doing that, we just ensure that it won't be displayed within the browser. And that's all we have to do for this class. But what we need to do now is apply it to the About text. And here's the problem. If you select About, you'll notice that we already have the Rollover class applied. Furthermore, if we come into the code view, you'll find that the Rollover class is applied to the Anchor element. We don't want to apply this class to the Anchor element itself, but rather just this text. So what we're going to do here in the code view is just open up a span element. And with this span element, we're going to go ahead and add the class attribute, and we're going to go ahead and choose the Move class. We want to make sure that we close the span class after the text About. Then if you come back to the design view, you'll notice that About is no longer visible. So that establishes the link in terms of its visual representation. But right now, we don't have any interactivity. Remember, when the end user mouses over this, we want the image to change its appearance. Well, if you were to look at this image, rollover.png, which we can do in the Assets panel, if we come over to the Assets panel, which I just double-clicked, if for some reason you don't see the Assets panel, you can come over to the Window menu, and from there you can choose Assets. We want to go ahead and find this rollover graphic. So as I scroll down, I'm not seeing it. I'm going to go ahead and refresh the list just to make sure that all the images are appearing. Again, I'll go ahead and scroll down. Here's rollover.png. You can see that we have the same image right next to the original image. So it's basically the same image with a different color, but it's part of the image. But we can't see that because we established a width for this anchor element through CSS. So what we want to do now, when we hover over this image, is essentially change the location of the image so this green version appears. I'm going to go ahead and collapse the Assets panel, and we need to go ahead and create a new selector. So in the CSS Designer, go ahead and select the Style element for the source. In the Selectors section, click the plus sign, and in this case, we're going to go ahead and create a pseudo selector. So we're going to type in a.rollover, and after rollover, we're going to go ahead and type in a colon, and then we want the hover option. Go ahead and press Enter or Return. And what we need to do is change the position of the background. So in the Property section, we can come over to the Background category, and inside the Background category, what we want to do is set the background position to a different value. we're going to go ahead and set both of these to pixel values. We want the right value to be 0, which represents the top and the bottom. And then what we want to do is come over here, and we want to set the left value to negative 159. So I need to make sure that I don't lose my blinking cursor there. I'm going to type in 159. Then I'll press Enter or Return. And remember, this is happening on hover, which is when the end user hovers over this anchor element. So if we go ahead and save this document and take a look at it within a web browser, when we mouse over that image, sure enough, it changes its color. So it may seem like it's a lot more work from the developer's perspective, but ultimately what you're doing is producing a far more efficient effect using CSS opposed to the older JavaScript alternative.